And I think we are live. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. I can see we already have people in the chat saying hello, hello from everywhere. Just to make sure that you can hear us and that you can hear me clearly, please type llama in the chat really quick. I've seen some llamas already. So I'm going to assume you can hear us. My name is Noelia, and I will be your host today. I have with me Jade, that will be teaching us some amazing tips and tricks in gouache today, but I'll let her tell you more about that in a little bit. As always, if you have questions for Jade as she paints along or for any of us, please type question in the chat in all caps, followed by your question. That way it'll be easy for me to spot. We will be answering as many questions as we can today. If they are relevant to what Jade is doing, I will be asking them right then. If not, I'll be saving them for a Q&A at the end. We do these live demos for free every Sunday, Tuesday, and Friday. So make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the little bell button so that you can get notified every time we go live. And with nothing else to add, Jade, do you want to show us a little bit of your work before we start?
Yeah, of course. And thank you everyone for joining. This is super exciting. So I'm just going to show you a few of my paintings. This guy is a John Constable study. And so this one I really just tried to focus on the contrast between light and color. So in this one you can see there's sort of like a storm cloud here, and that contrasts with the left side of the painting here, which is brighter. And in these two, I just played around with the colors and just sort of how the light interacts with the clouds during the sunset. So this one was a great study of John Constable, who is one of my favorite Romantic era painters. So I think it's really great to learn from the masters.
Yeah.
And then I have my little mini sketchbook here. This is, I named this one Peachy Clouds. It's like a sunset study. And this one I drew from my imagination. So I think it's really great to learn how to fill a page when you don't have a reference photo. And so this one really allowed me to be creative and sort of learn how to balance the composition on a page. So we have the lower half of the painting with the trees here, and then the upper half with the clouds. And so this one, I didn't do any sketching or anything. I just put the paint on paper and sort of just let it go. So this one was really interesting. And I love this sketchbook because with the small pages, you don't really feel an obligation to sort of fill a really big page. And so this one was really great in sort of being creative and experimenting. And then this one is the one that we'll be doing today. And this is one of my favorite sunsets that I've ever photographed. And so I find myself coming back to this reference photo a lot. And I just really love the colors in this scene. And it just really always inspires me. And so, yeah, this one, I love to repaint photos. And I think that's something that you can keep in mind because you don't always have to just paint things once. And it's really great to learn if you repaint things. So maybe if you wanted to learn how to balance the composition more, maybe if you want the sky to fill up more of the page or have the landscape part take up less of the page, then yeah, you can just really learn how to balance a composition. So yeah, those are just a few examples. And I'm just going to get right into the demo for today.
Awesome. And for everyone joining us today, our reference image is in the description of the video, but I will also be throwing it in the chat really quick.
Perfect. So I did a little black and white study of the painting we'll be doing today. I think just sort of highlighting where the light hits is great when you're planning out the painting. And so if you do a value study like this, then it's easy to see where the shadows and the light lies in the painting, and so it's easier to translate that into color.
Do you usually do a value study before you do a painting?
This one was actually the first one I did, but I found it really helpful actually. I've painted this reference photo a couple times, but seeing it in this format is really helpful because you can sort of see like where the sun hits the top of the clouds or sort of where the silhouettes lie in the landscape. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed painting that.
Awesome.
And I've pre-sketched the painting for today. So if you would want to learn a little bit more about how to, or the sketching process, then you can definitely feel free to sign up for my mini workshop where I'll be doing that in depth a little more. So I'm using Arteza colors today. And these guys are pre-mixed. So I find it a little bit less time consuming because you don't have to mix all of your colors. So I will be using sky blue and blush pink. And that is for the sky part, which we're gonna start with.
And you are using gouache, right?
Yes, this is Arteza Gouache. And a little bit of white. White is definitely my most used color. Okay.
We have a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Donatella asks, well, she first says, nice sketchbook. Is it a Etchr one?
Yes, so this is an Etchr A5 sketchbook. It's a really nice size, and this size is A6, so I have the mini one and the bigger one. All right, so I'm gonna start with the sky here, and I'm gonna start by color blocking, which basically you just sort of rough out the colors where you want them to be. So I'm just mixing on my palette here. And this is a filbert brush, which I find to be really great for filling in larger spaces of color. I'll also be adding a little bit of black because it adds a tint to it, so it's a little bit more muted. So you add black if you want it to be tinted in white. White also mutes it a little bit, and so I'll be showing you how I use white a little bit later on.
Are you using titanium white or just white? Or what kind of white?
Use a set, it's just white. So if you look at the reference photo, it's a little bit of a purplish color. So I'm just starting out with that, and this is probably a little bit darker than I want it to be, so I'm adding a little bit of white. And a little bit more blue. And then I also have a test paper that I like to test my colors on before I put it onto the painting. And so I can just see how that looks. And I like that for now, so I'm going to just start by filling in the top of the painting.
And have you taped the edges of it?
Yes, the edges are taped. This is just good old Scotch magic tape.
Is there a reason why you use that one versus like a masking tape?
Yeah, so I used to only use masking tape, and it worked pretty good, but I switched over to Scotch tape, and I think it definitely doesn't rip the paper as much as masking tape. So I just find it easier to use. And it forms a really nice seal with the paper too. So usually no paint gets through. And then when I want to blend down, I just add a little bit of water. I have a water bowl off to the side here. And so
all you did was wet the brush?
yeah, I wet it a little bit. And then I also patted it dry just slightly on a paper towel so that it doesn't create a puddle of water in the paper. So I wet it again. And one thing that I really like about gouache is that it almost acts like a very pigmented watercolor. And so it's very easy to use. And you can see in the middle section of the photo, it's pretty light. And also my color study here, or value study, there's sort of a gradient from dark to light. So that's what I'll be creating here. And this stage definitely doesn't have to be perfect because we're just sort of roughing out the colors and how you want it to look.
And are you avoiding painting over where your clouds would be? Or?
Yeah, so this is like the brightest part of the cloud. So it's okay if you go over that because we're gonna go in with some white later anyways, but I just like to avoid it. So I'm just creating a nice smooth gradient. And again, this brush is really great for that because the bristles make it really smooth. Okay, so I'm gonna make it a little bit brighter. And I'm going over the sketch a little bit because I sort of know where those shapes are going to lie, and I'll go back over them later.
Is there a reason why you do that?
Well, I like to do that because then the color is distributed evenly. And so if I just left that there and then painted over it, then there might be some spaces I want to fill in later.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So just working on this gradient.
I think this is the cool thing about gouache that you can't achieve with watercolor.
Yeah, watercolor is definitely not as opaque. And gouache, it blends so nicely. It's one of my favorite things about it. Okay, so if you look at the reference photo, this whole area here is sort of covered by clouds. And so I'm going to go in with a darker color. And that's sort of the bottom part of the clouds.
So you're adding a little bit of black to your original purple?
A little bit of black.
What size and what brand brush are you using right now?
This is a Hemi brush. I'm not exactly sure what size it is. I'll hold it up so you can see it better.
Looks maybe like an 8, 10?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. But
It's a round brush, isn't it?
This is a filbert brush, I believe.
Okay.
So I'm just going in and sort of sketching the shape of the clouds. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect at all at this stage because we're going to go back in and blend it out later.
And that's your cloud shadows, right?
Yes. And this brush is also really great for textures.
It seems to be more of a natural hair brush.
Yeah, I think this is boar bristle. And my gouache is a little bit translucent here, so I'm gonna make it a little more pigmented just by blending more of the paint.
Do you know if synthetic brushes are better for gouache?
I have a few. I think this guy right here, which I'm going to be using later, I think this is synthetic. I use them for different purposes, so I don't really know if I can say how well they blend. I think they're pretty much equal.
Okay. In my experience, I've learned that especially when using thicker paint, the natural hair brushes will leave more of a texture behind.
Yeah, I think they definitely do. Because the bristles on this brush are pretty uniform. I mean, this brush is kind of old and mangy, but in a new brush, it would pretty much be like a flat line like that. But with the bristles, they're not always perfectly in line. And so they definitely do create more of a texture.
Yeah, and they're thicker too.
Yeah, this one is thicker. So I'm just sort of going over the bottom of the clouds. And I just added some water there. So in this upper corner, we have this cloud shape sort of protruding to the left. And that helps balance this side. And then the middle will be the white part. And so in this photo, it's really balanced. And so it looks good to the eye.
So what do you look for to make your painting balanced?
I just try to fill up the space as well as I can, because if you have like a very large open space, then it might look a little off. And so here, when you sort of fill up the space equally, I think it looks better. Okay, so I'm gonna switch over to my other brush just for these smaller parts.
And does it just have water on it?
Yeah, so I just wet it and then dried it on a paper towel so that your brush is not too wet. And I'm sort of blending this up because it starts to get lighter there.
And from your original purple, you've just added white for the color you're mixing with?
So again, I'm just sort of roughing out the shape.
And you are using water to dilute your gouache, right?
Yeah. That's one thing I love about gouache is it's so versatile because you can make it more opaque by adding less water or more translucent by adding more water. And so you can really achieve a really big range of colors and textures. So I'm leaving this part brighter than the rest because I'm going to fill that in later. And I'm just going to blend out the edges a little bit. And then I still have the bottom half of the sky here. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. And from the photo, the bottom part is similar to this color. It's a little bit darker. And I'm going to add some white because there's a bright section sort of towards the top.
I've noticed sometimes when you add white, you go straight to the white and into your painting and blend it as you paint.
That might not be best practice, but it's easier for me to blend it on the page. So I can just sort of adjust how the colors look.
Mm-hmm.
And gouache is very easy to blend while it's still wet. If it dries a little, it's a little bit harder. So I'm trying to do this quickly so that it doesn't dry on me. Gonna make a little bit more of that purple color. And then this section is pretty much all bright. So I'm going to go in with a lighter color and just blend that down. And I'm just going to go over it again to make sure it's all nice and blended.
With a clean, wet brush?
Yeah, and I didn't clean it completely, so it still has a little bit of the color left on it. I think that helps it blend a little bit better. And so there, I've created a nice gradient from dark to light. And since I went over the dark part, I'm going to go over it again, just to define the edge a little bit better.
So how long have you been painting with gouache?
I started out with watercolors, so I think it's been a little over a year with gouache. Actually, my first paint that I ever tried was acrylic paints that I got from my grandma when I was little. And so I sort of went from acrylic to watercolor, and then I tried gouache, and it's definitely been my favorite. So this brush is old, but that's nice because it adds some texture. I don't want the bottom to be super defined. It can be a little bit rough. and just sort of blend into the bottom here.
And that's the bottom of your clouds.
Yeah. And I can always adjust that later on, maybe if I want it to be a little bit smoother, so that it looks more natural. So I just wet my brush again and then dried it a little bit, and then I'm just blending the bottom. I think a lot of painting is just trial and error, and you kind of see how it looks on the page, and if you like it, you can keep it that way, and if you don't, you can change it up.
Yeah, it's making adjustments as you go.
Yeah. Okay, so that's sort of the shadow part. And now I'm going to start with the pink color for the highlights. This is a pretty bright pink. I'm going to add a little bit of the purple in just to tone it down a little bit. And then I'm just going to go along the top and create highlights.
Is there a reason why you just dab the brush on the page instead of a swiping motion?
Well, I think it gets the fluffiness of the cloud nicely. If I just swiped it, it would just be like a line. And so dabbing it sort of creates more texture, and it sort of blends it as you go. So again, I'm just roughing this out. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to blend it later. And I think that pink is a little bit too muted, so I'm going to see how I like it with just the pink. So I'm just going across the top where the sun would hit. The bottom is pretty much just going to stay darker.
And you're still avoiding that very bright
So
spot,
I'm
aren't
actually
you?
going to just start blending up a little, and I'm going to clean my brush for this. So it has a little bit of pink on it, but not as much as before. And I'm going to add white. So again, I'm dabbing with the edge of the brush here, and so it's more precise. And it creates a nice rounded look.
Is there a reason why you choose to use a flat brush?
I think flat brushes are easy. I could use a round brush like this, but the tip is just so pointy that I think the flat brush creates a better texture. And I sort of like the impressionist style that flat brushes give you, because round brushes can be super precise, and so they give you really good detail.
Mm-hmm.
But I just personally like how the flat brush looks.
Awesome. Yeah, I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me a little bit of Monet skies.
Yeah, I love Monet. He's my favorite artist.
And by the way, we're about 30 minutes in.
Okay. So I've created the highlights there, and that contrasts nicely with the bottom. I'm going to bring the bottom up a little bit more. Just lightly dabbing again. And then I wiped my brush off to get rid of some of that color so that I can go in and blend it with the pink. I'm blending the bottom of the pink that I painted before so that it blends nicely into the purple part. And I just have a little bit more to highlight on this side.
And you keep glancing at your reference, don't you? To
I'm
find where
actually
the
looking
pinks
at
are.
this. I'm not looking
Oh,
at the
do you ever, since I'm assuming the pictures are on your phone, your
Yeah,
reference pictures, do you ever edit them so that they are in grayscale before you paint?
I did do that when I painted this value study. But also sometimes I send them to my Google Drive so I can look at them bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I highlighted the top part of these clouds here, and I like how that looks for now, so I'm going to move on to the bottom. And this is where the green comes in. This is sap green. And then I'm going to blend it with some black and latte brown.
Latte brown. Makes me think of our coffee conversation we were having earlier.
A little bit too much black.
I think it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. For the bottom part, I'm just gonna start with the shadows like I did before. And so you can see there's sort of a shadow up here, and then it gets lighter near the bottom part. That's a little bit dark, so I'm gonna add some more latte brown.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm doing sort of like a pulling motion with the brush. I think that creates the illusion of trees nicely.
Yeah, I can see that now that you mention it.
Mm-hmm.
Ramona in the chat, by the way, says it's amazing how the touch of blending pulls those clouds together.
Yeah, it really is. I think painting would be nothing without blending. Okay, so just filling in these spots.
And you did the same as you did with the sky. Didn't you wet your brush a little bit?
Yeah, I wet it a little bit and brought it down. That just helps it cover a larger area easier without having to re-dip into the paint. And also there's going to be a lighter section around here, so I don't want it to be too dark.
So it thins your paint out a bit too.
Yeah. So again, just roughing it out. There's a lighter section here, so I'm leaving that for now, and I'll come back to it since I'm already working with the dark color.
I know a lot of artists work light to dark. Is there a reason why you work dark to light?
I think it's easier for me to blend it. And when I see where the shadows are, it's easier for me to place the highlights on top of that.
Okay.
So I think it's a matter of personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you can definitely do light to dark.
And I guess with gouache, it's easier to do dark to light because you can layer on top versus watercolor. You have to save.
Watercolor is definitely easier light to dark because it's not as opaque, so you can't cover it up.
Mm-hmm. You got to preserve the whites you have on the paint.
Okay, so just filling in this bottom part here. And this part is lighter since it's in the foreground. So I'm just adding more water and filling that in.
I noticed when you first started, your sketch seemed to have just the main shapes versus a lot of detail.
Yeah, because I'm gonna cover it up anyways when I paint. So I just do a rough shape so that I can sort of see how it looks in my head before I put the paint down. Okay, so I've just filled that in so I can see how it looks. And then I'm gonna, in this area, I'm going to add some more of that latte brown and green. Add a little bit of white actually.
Awesome.
Gonna see how that looks. And I'm using that same pulling motion just to fill in the area. It's okay if you go over the shadows because I'm going to repaint that.
Barbara asks, well, first she says, "This is beautiful," and then asks, "Could you tell her from which direction the sunlight is coming?"
Yeah, so in this picture, the sunlight is coming from behind where I was standing. And I live near mountains, so there's a shadow over the land, and then the sun was just hitting the top of the clouds here. So that's why this whole bottom part is darker than the top here.
So it looks like the sun is starting to set,
Yes.
but behind.
Yeah, so behind where I was standing.
Yep.
so now that I have this light part filled in, I can go back and define this area.
I have a question from Anna for you, Jade, if you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on using dried up gouache on your palette? Do you prefer working with fresh paint straight from the tube?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because gouache, you can re-wet it and use it, but then that makes it less opaque. And so I find myself ending up using paint from the tube anyways to make it more opaque. So personally, I do like to use it straight from the tube. So I try not to put a lot onto my palette because if it dries up, then it's not as thick as it is when it comes out of the tube.
So you like painting with very thick, heavy paint?
Yeah. And I think thicker paint creates a nicer texture, especially in landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
And this part's a little lighter than I want it to be, so I wet my brush and then dried it a little bit so I can sort of blend it and just add some texture. You don't have to really go for specific shapes here because it's so far in the distance that you can't really tell exactly what it is, so you just add texture using your brush.
This is amazing. It amazes me how you can do this, and you're, what, 18?
Yeah, I'm 18.
I love it. And what is your mini workshop going to be on again?
It is on April 18th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time.
And what will you be painting?
I'll be painting a sunset using warm colors, and I'll go through the whole sketching process. So just a little bit more of an in-depth view of my process.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I will be dropping the link to Jade's mini workshop if you want to support her and learn a little bit more from her. Sign up. Coming up on April 18th.
Oops, sorry. I'd love to see all of you there. Okay, so I've sort of created the illusion of shadows, and then we have the highlights here. And up in this section here, there's a little bit more highlights. So I'm just going to add a little bit. And then here in the lower part, it's also a bit lighter. So I can go back in with a lighter color and just define this area. So the nice thing about gouache is that the lighter colors, if you use thick enough paint, will cover up the darker colors. So this brush creates really nice shapes when you sort of dab it along. So that gives the illusion of plants.
I feel like flat brushes always create interesting shapes when you dab them onto the page.
And I can offset some of that with more of the shadows. So these layers just create a nice illusion.
So you aren't really painting bushes, you aren't painting grass, you're creating the illusion of them.
Yeah. So I don't really try to paint the exact shape of a bush because then it ends up not looking like a bush somehow. And so I just go for sort of a rough estimate, and then I just move my brush along and create texture. Because if we tried to paint everything how it looked, then, I mean, there's so much detail in a photograph that you can't really capture in a painting. And so when you just sort of go with the flow and dab your brush along, then I think that makes it look nice and textured.
Yeah.
So I left this space blank here because that is where the tree is. And the tree is darker than the rest of the photo. So I'm just going with a very dark green so that it looks almost black. And I didn't bring the sky down into this section because it's pretty much going to be covered up by the black anyways. So I'm using that same pulling motion to create leaves and branches. And right now it just sort of looks like a black blob, so we're going to go in and add a little bit of branches here in the middle.
Black blob. Everything though kind of starts with a blob, doesn't it?
Yeah, everything starts as a blob and then you add the detail. So I'm just playing with the edges until I like how it looks. And I'm going to bring some of this black over here.
And why are you doing that?
I think it helps balance the colors because we have such a dark shape over here. If you don't bring some of that into the rest of the painting, then it'll look a little bit unbalanced. And there's not a lot of paint on my brush, so it does give a nice textured effect.
You can see it's like the bristles have spread apart a little bit. And it's
Yeah,
just
this is a really old brush. It's not in tip-top condition, but that's completely fine because it gives really great texture.
yeah, it creates really interesting marks when you
Yeah.
dab it on the page.
So like here you can see sort of, since the bristles are spread apart, it sort of gives the illusion of leaves there. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the bush over here. And this corner is really light, so I'm adding a little bit more black. just like really lightly brushing over the surface. Okay, so I'm gonna add the branch here that I talked about before.
And you're mixing more of that latte brown.
Yeah, so I'm mixing the latte brown with a little bit of the green, so that's not too bright. And then just using the edge of my brush and putting down like what a tree trunk would look like.
And you're creating the line more by dabbing than pulling a line, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason for why you do that?
I mean, I think it's just something that I do.
Fair.
I think pulling it just doesn't look as natural as I want it to be, because pulling will create a more uniform line, and so I can add more texture just by dabbing it.
Mm-hmm. It creates a more organic shape.
Yeah. And so I can sort of bring that out here. Doesn't have to be really prominent, because just with a little bit you can see how that offsets the darkness of the tree.
Yeah.
And so there's the trunk. And I'm looking at this too, just to see what it looks like. I'm using that same color to do a little bit of highlighting, which is just more dabbing. And I'm just really lightly going on top of the black, and that makes it sort of pop, so you can see how this color contrasts with the dark color in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you've added some dimension to the tree, so that's not just a black blob.
Yeah. It now definitely looks like a tree.
Mm-hmm. And this part looks a little bit lighter than I intended. So again, I'm cleaning my brush a little and just blending it. And I think we are pretty much done.
Wow.
Yeah. So the
Beautiful.
bottom part is nice and textured, and then you have the contrast with the colors and the clouds. So there's a light part and a dark part, and it all just plays really nicely on the page. And so now my favorite part.
Yes, I love that.
I can get the tape off.
There
we go.
Nancy says, this is gorgeous. Looking forward to April 18th.
Yay, thank you, Nancy. Can't wait to see you there. And I hope you guys learned a few tips and tricks. Or hopefully you just relax, watch a nice painting demo. And hopefully you'll find some time to paint today.
Yeah, I am dropping the link to Jade's workshop in the chat again. And we have another question, Jade.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have touched on this before already. Did you work or do you still work in watercolors?
I don't anymore. I used to do more like watercolor florals as opposed to landscapes. So when I switched to gouache, I started doing more landscapes. But gouache does have some watercolor tendencies to it, like when I blended it. So I don't know if that counts, but no, I don't really work with watercolors anymore.
But you used to. That's how you
Yeah,
started into gouache.
And I really love gouache because of the texture it creates. I don't know if you can really create that same texture with watercolors.
Right. I work more with watercolors, and I feel like you need to use your paints and your brushes differently to create that texture
Yeah.
than what you
And
would
then
with gouache.
sort of more of the colors and the shades with watercolor. With gouache, since the paint is thick, then like the paint itself is the texture.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Beth asks, any more tips on blending? Her clouds aren't as fluffy as yours.
I think my biggest tip is to use sort of a semi-clean brush. So I have my water bowl here, and I just dip it into the water and then I pat it on my paper towel, and that takes some of the water out so it doesn't pool on your paper. And so I find that to be really helpful when I'm blending, because the water sort of activates the gouache so that you can spread it and blend it together.
Awesome.
Yeah.
People are saying this looks awesome. I am going to throw our feedback survey link in the chat. It takes about 15 to 30 seconds to fill it out. So please do. If you followed along, we would love to see your versions of this painting. So tag us with the hashtag Etchr Mini Workshop. That also enters you in a giveaway each month. Jade, is there Instagram page that people could follow to see more of your artwork?
Yes, so it's Jade May Art, which is spelled Jade Maie Art. And if you guys painted along, I'd really love to see what you created. I'm sharing everything on my story if you send it to me through my DMs. And of course, if you have any questions or anything that I didn't get to answer, I'd be so happy to answer them on my Instagram too.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jade. Thank you all for joining us. There are awesome comments coming in, Jade. How beautiful your work is, beautiful sunset, beautiful painting, the sky is gorgeous, and a lot of thank yous.
Oh, thank you everyone so much for joining me today.
Yeah. Thank you all. Hopefully, we see you in Jade's mini workshop. I will drop the link to the chat again. It's happening April 18th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, Jade.
Yes.
And I'm dropping the link to our feedback survey again. And we'll see you in future live demos and mini workshops.
Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye bye.